I'm Ray Bush, and I'm at the Political Economy, Knowledge and Solidarity Liberation from Asia to Africa workshop held in Tunis. And I'm delighted to be with Brahim Rouabah, who is looking at the debate and context of uprising or revolution in Algeria. And he's also very interested in how he understands the process of knowledge production during the struggles that are currently taking place. And the first thing I wanted to ask is it a revolution? What does it actually look like?
Right. I think it's a really interesting question, and there is a debate happening on what makes a revolution a revolution. When is it only an uprising? When is it only a social movement? And so on. But if we are to use the word revolution for what is happening in Algeria, then what I would personally mean by that is a revolution in people's thinking and people's relationship to power and to questions of legitimacy, questions of rule, questions of authority, and so on. So, because of the, traditionally, or at least in traditional Marxist terms, a revolution will, it's judged, if you like, by the material results of it, changing the relations and the relations of production and the structures of power. That is one way of looking at it, and I think I would call that a successful revolution in some ways, but I think there is also a mental or a psychological and ideational component to revolutions, and so that's that's the aspect, or those are the dimensions in regards to which I would say that what's happening in Algeria, for example, is a revolution.
In looking at that, you, in your presentation to the workshop, had a very clear historical periodization. There was the colonial period, there was the 90s, the coup and the aftermath, and there was the February 22, 2019 process, which is still playing out. Why do you use these three conjunctures?
Well, for multiple reasons. One of them being it's what the movement on the streets is making references to, and also there is the material conditions that those foundational moments in Algerian history represent. So, with the anti-colonial struggle and the sort of formal independence, one could see it as a process of recommoning what had been sort of extracted or by the colonial system, the dispossession, whatever the Algerian people were dispossessed of. I.e. the land, to a certain extent sovereignty, popular sovereignty, and so on. With formal independence, one could see that as a process of putting that back into the commons. Irrespective of the form that it is taken, one could say it's bringing it into state control, not people's control. That's one argument that could make. But nonetheless, one could see it as a recommoning of the colonial dispossession. With the 1990s, the coup in '92, in January 11th, actually, the 28th anniversary is in a couple of days of that coup, and what it has the process that it has engendered, which I believe is commonly talked about even in academic discourse as or framed as a civil war, as and I think that is mainly due to the mainstream framing, hegemonic framings post Cold War, in understanding and studying political violence in the global south. But I see it more as a process. What that had started is a process of in some ways, primitive accumulation accumulation through dispossession. That's the main dispossession in the last 60 years in Algeria happened in the 90s, or it started really in the 90s. Growing up in Algeria in the 80s, I didn't have the concept of a billion. That was an alien concept to me. But the privatization of publicly owned goods, companies, and institutions, the fortunes that were made overnight, the laying offs that took place, millions of or hundreds of thousands lost their jobs, and by extension, millions were pauperized in that process. So there is that was a stage in which Algerians were dispossessed materially. And what came in the 2000s, and that's when what we call now the oligarchy, the Algerian oligarchy or military oligarchy, that's when it was really constructed. The military side of it has a longer history and goes back to the anti-colonial struggle and the moment of formal independence. But the oligarchic component is really sort of comes into being in the 90s and the 2000s. 2000s it's accelerated, and there is a process of compradorization of that oligarchy. So that's the dispossession that happens on the material level. On the ideational level, there is a different form of dispossession. In 2005, you have the so-called reconciliation law, which effectively is enforced amnesia on what happened in the 90s, which prevents a law that prevents Algerians from putting or questioning the role of who killed who in the 90s, who was doing all those massacres, what happened in the 90s. So the official narrative, if you like, has to be taken as at face value. So, and for me, that's a form of dispossession. The people are being dispossessed of their memory, of their history, so it's concomitant and it's complementary to the material dispossession that Algerians were subjected to in the 90s.
Finally, you made a point throughout your presentation about knowledge production. Knowledge production running alongside driving or a product of the revolutionary process. Could you give a couple of examples for that?
Right. So I think when you have when in similar conjunctures like this, when you have popular movements like this, be it we won't split hairs about whether this is an uprising or revolution or that the struggle is not only it doesn't only get played out on the streets and in the battlefield, if you like, but also in terms of the narrative. Who narrates what is happening? Who explains? Who interprets what's happening? Who represents it? According to what frameworks? According to what periodizations? And in what sort of temporality and towards what telos such representation or interpretation happens. And you tend to either have, there is a geographical, there is a racial, there is a class dimension to all of this. Who has access to write in certain newspapers, in what language, what kind of audience do they have access to, and so on and so forth. I say this again because I sort of I lived in Tunisia, just post uprising revolution, 2000 in 2011 and until 2016, and I sort of witnessed firsthand how that process unfolded. Who was writing on Tunisia? What did they think the Tunisian uprising or revolution was about? And then the gulf between what was written and what Tunisians were telling me in Tunisia. So that made me sort of very sensitive to keep an eye out on how is the popular movement in Algeria being narrated, by whom, what do they think it's about, and so on and so forth. And I think one way of doing it, or at least that's what my approach to avoiding that pitfall, is to let the street speak for itself. For example, looking at the slogans. What are they saying? Why are they saying it in this way? What are they not saying? And why? And why are they saying what they are saying at that particular moment? Because there are some of the slogans that we see have not changed since last February, and they have been constant, albeit in different inflections throughout the last 11 months, whereas others have sort of mutated and taken different forms depending on the conjuncture, the short durée conjuncture, if you like. So that's sort of that's what I mean by that. And also, generally, when people speak about knowledge production, we think of certain institutions such as the university and so on, and I think moving away from that, seeing the role of the street, seeing the role of the football stadium, seeing the role of groupings and how these slogans come about, who puts them up, who sings them the first time, how do they get diffused. There is an example of one of the weeks, one of the Fridays. The next one will be the 47th consecutive Friday of protest, and today is the 46th Tuesday. So hundreds of thousands of people were on the streets today in Algeria. You see how a group of women, for example, would chant a slogan this week. That video gets circulated and goes viral, and then the next week you have millions of people chanting that. So there is the production, the dissemination that doesn't happen at a university, and the dissemination does not happen in a peer-reviewed academic journal, but it takes the form of new technology, social media, but without sort of fetishizing it, because I know that in the last few years, sort of the social media has been sort of put on a pedestal.
Facebook revolution.
Exactly. In fact, Facebook has played a particularly vicious role in Algeria, where thousands, if not tens of thousands, of pages, accounts belonging to journalists, bloggers, and critical voices in general who are trying to cover what's happening have been shut down in total complicity with the oligarchy and military oligarchy in Algeria, and with the complicity of the regional office in the UAE, where they have great sort of say in anything that is published in Arabic, for example. That's in addition to the shares that they own through their sovereign fund.
Thank you very much.
Of course, it's my pleasure.